You know better than to mess with Mexican drug cartels, but President Donald Trump crossed the line in his first week in office. A war is brewing, and we have already started counting bodies. The Delta Force, Army Green Berets, Navy SEAL team. Are they able to save everyone from the impending danger if their own lives are at risk? Watch to find out what led to this shocking escalation, how the cartels are responding, and whether this war will change the future of the drug trade forever. Trump declares war on cartels. On January 20th, 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order calling for the designation of Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. This gave special forces like the Delta Force authorization to go after these drug cartels, deploying any means necessary to annihilate their drug supply chains to the U.S.
Furthermore, I will order the Department of Defense to make appropriate use of special forces, cyber warfare, and other overt and covert actions to inflict maximum damage on cartel leadership, infrastructure, and operation.
This video went viral on the internet sometime last year, and to make matters even worse for these cartels, the Trump administration also promised to sign legislation.
Finally, as I have said before, I will ask Congress to pass legislation ensuring that drug smugglers and human traffickers receive the death penalty. The drug cartels and their allies in the Biden administration have the blood of countless millions on their hands. Millions and millions of families and people are being destroyed.
So drug smugglers and human traffickers receive the death penalty. This was an open threat to the cartels by the Trump administration, and they were going to respond in the best way they know how to: brutal violence. Early in the month of February, a Texas border rancher was killed near the border by a suspected cartel IED. 74-year-old Antonio Cespedes Saldierna worked on both sides of the border, and according to the reports, he was driving on his ranch when he hit an explosive device, causing it to detonate. Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller announced that the deadly explosion is a clear sign of the increasing threat of cartel activities along the southern border and urged ranchers in the area to exercise extreme caution. Saldierna's son, Ramiro Cespedes, a U.S. Army veteran who was injured by an IED during a deployment, was shocked to learn of his father's killing back home. Commenting on the attack, Ramiro insisted that it was a terrorist attack and so should be treated as such. Also, border agents have received warnings about increased threats from cartels after the Trump administration designated some of them as foreign terrorist organizations. It's getting more intense, and unfortunately, these cartels are taking off the steam on innocent people, even students. In the early days of March, the bodies of 9 missing students were found dismembered in San Jose Miahuatlan, on the border of the states of Puebla and Oaxaca, around 175 miles from Mexico City. Authorities reported that the students were reported missing 3 days before their severed body parts were found in an abandoned car on the highway. 5 students' decomposing bodies were found under a blood-soaked tarp, while the other 4 were twisted inside the car's trunk. Each student had their hands chopped off and crammed into a bag, which was then stuffed inside the car trunk by the highway. Local authorities suspect this to be the work of drug cartels, as they continue to sound the alarm that they are not to be messed with. Some of the bodies could not be identified due to the state in which they were found, but among the ones that were still recognizable were 19-year-old Brenda Mariel, 21-year-old Leslie Noya Trejo, 28-year-old Raul Emanuel, and Rolando Armando. Authorities believe more attacks like this could be on the way, making it crucial for everyone to stay safe as the U.S. intensifies its war on the cartels. Perhaps the most intriguing development to this is the involvement of Delta Force. The Delta Force vs. Cartels. The Delta Force, also known as Delta Force or Combat Applications Group, is a special operations force of the United States Army under the operational control of the Joint Special Operation Commands. The force has a growing reputation in counterterrorism, hostage rescue, direct action, and special reconnaissance, often against high-value targets. The Delta Force belongs to the U.S. military's Tier 1 Special Mission Units, tasked with performing the most complex, covert, and dangerous missions as directed by the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. Through the years, the Department of Defense has clearly controlled all information about the Delta Force and its activities, refusing all public interviews unless the unit is part of a major operation or a unit member has been killed. They are known to be ruthless and brutal in their operations, and most people believe that they are the country's best advantage in causing maximum damage to these Mexican cartels. The most recent update about the force that is shared with the public will be the October 2019 raid. On the 26th of October, October 2019, Delta operators, accompanied by members of the 75th Ranger Regiment, conducted a raid on the compound of Islamic State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leading to his death. So the big question's on everyone's mind. Can Delta Force make a real impact on the U.S. drug crisis? Do they stand a chance against these ruthless cartels? Brent Tucker, a Delta Force veteran, gave an interview earlier this year, sharing his thoughts on a potential fight against the cartels. Having spent years in the force, he knows better than most what combat looks like and what Delta Force is truly capable of. According to him, the Tier 1 force will effectively smash drug cartels if ordered to by President Donald Trump. They're more of a terrorist organization, right? What do terrorist organizations do? They hit people when they're not looking. Brent shared about the cartels. If you think they're on the flat range every day like a Tier 1 element, if you think they have the technology and the assets a Tier 1 element has, you're sorely mistaken. We would absolutely wipe the floor with them. Concluding the interview, Brent admitted that the combat will not be an easy one and many lives will be lost. However, he remained adamant about the fact that the cartels were simply a no match for the Delta Force. Many continue to point to the 2016 Operation Black Swan, which led to the recapture of Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, as proof of this. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was the infamous leader of the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. El Chapo rose to power by forming strong alliances, using ruthless tactics to eliminate threats, and constantly finding new, sophisticated ways to smuggle drugs across borders. He built his drug empire with connections with Colombian cocaine suppliers, establishing a highly efficient distribution network that moved drugs into the U.S. and other markets. Authorities reported that his cartel used tunnels, submarines, hidden compartments in vehicles, and even commercial shipping routes to transport tons of drugs undetected. One of El Chapo's most talked about skills was his ability to escape from prison. He escaped twice. The first was in 2001 by hiding in a laundry cart, and again in 2015 through a sophisticated underground tunnel that led from his prison cell to a safe house. These escapes cemented his street reputation and also humiliated Mexican authorities. But in 2016, members of the U.S. Army's Delta Force and the Marshals, in strong partnerships with the Mexican Marines, pursued the extradition of Guzman to the United States. On the 8th of January 2016, these forces moved into position to raid a house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, believed to be occupied by one of Guzman's top assassins, or sicarios. As they entered the building, an intense gunfight ensued between the Marines and several armed assailants, leaving 5 of the cartel gunmen dead and 6 wounded. One Marine was also wounded. During the heated firefight, the Marines discovered Guzman, who fled the house through a series of tunnels and then attempted to escape in a stolen vehicle. Shortly after, he was spotted by federal agents and apprehended outside a motel a short distance away from the house. He was one of the most dangerous figures in Mexican organized crime, yet authorities managed to capture him with minimal casualties. This is why many people continue to argue against the cartels having the upper hand in the battle against the Delta Force. Also new on the internet, a few select groups of people are protesting that there's no way a team as specialized as Delta Force will successfully engage in direct combat with the Mexican drug empire. According to them, it's just a waste of resources. First, the scope and size of the Delta Force are too small compared to these cartels. The Delta Force is a small, highly specialized unit with only a few hundred operators at any given time. By design, the force addresses high-risk missions such as hostage rescues, assassinations of key targets, and intelligence gathering. No one knows how Delta Force would fare in a prolonged war, but that's exactly where the cartels thrive. They operate on a massive scale, with entire networks of foot soldiers, enforcers, informants, and even corrupt government officials working in their favor. For instance, the Sinaloa cartel is estimated to have 30,000 to 50,000 members, with access to military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, and even drones. It's very likely that if the Delta Force is deployed to fight these cartels directly, they would be vastly outnumbered and would require continuous reinforcements, air support, and logistical supply chains. Also, people believe that the structure of the cartel just makes it even more difficult for the Delta Force to defeat them. You see, cartels don't usually engage in traditional battlefield warfare. They use ambushes and hit-and-run attacks and blend into the civilian population to avoid large-scale confrontations. A very compelling example of what might happen in the U.S. following Delta Force's deployment is the arrest of Ovidio Guzman by the Mexican military. In 2019, the Mexican military attempted to arrest Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, in Culiacan, but the Sinaloa cartel responded by launching a citywide attack, taking hostages, setting vehicles on fire, and even outgunning the Mexican military. Eventually, former Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was forced to order his release to avoid more bloodshed. Chances are very high that if an elite special forces unit like Delta Force were to go after cartel leadership, they could face similar overwhelming retaliation, putting not just their lives at risk, but also American citizens and businesses operating in Mexico. Perhaps the most important consideration in this debate is that the Delta Force is majorly unilateral. Delta Force operates on U.S. commands, meaning that it carries out missions based on U.S. interests without necessarily needing permission from other countries. They are only deployed to address cases in places where the U.S. has direct involvement. However, Mexico is a sovereign nation with its own government, military, and law enforcement agencies. Sending U.S. troops into Mexican soil to fight the cartels without Mexico's approval might be considered an act of war, severely damaging U.S.-Mexico relations. Even if Mexico did approve such a mission, it would require a coordinated effort between governments, intelligence agencies, and military forces, making the unilateral Delta Force operation unrealistic. Another very big obstacle to any U.S. military intervention is the level of cartel influence within Mexican politics. Over the years, we've seen numerous reports exposing how cartel money has funded political campaigns, bribed high-ranking officials, and even infiltrated law enforcement agencies. If Delta Force were deployed against the cartels, they wouldn't just be fighting cartel soldiers. They'd also face resistance from corrupt politicians, local law enforcement, and even elements of the military who are compromised. And this, as many argue, is not the job of the force. How the cartel could win. In 2023, new research proved that the cartel is Mexico's fifth largest employer of labor. This makes the problem even more difficult to solve for the U.S. government, as it is no longer just a military challenge, but a socio-economic and political one. And history has proven time and time again that large-scale and forceful interventions against groups like this often lead to unintended consequences. This is seen clearly in the war in Afghanistan against the Taliban. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute, the U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, deployed advanced military technology, and carried out thousands of airstrikes, yet the Taliban remained intact and ultimately regained full control in August 2021 after the U.S. withdrawal. The reason is simple. The Taliban was deeply integrated into Afghan society. They provided governance, collected taxes, and even ran a parallel judicial system in areas they controlled. Reports from organizations like the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, and the Brookings Institution detail how U.S. attempts to dismantle the Taliban failed because the group was not just a military force, but also an economic and political entity. The Mexican cartels are not very different either. We've seen that they are not just criminal organizations. They provide livelihoods, infrastructure, and even governance in areas neglected by the state. You look at Pablo Escobar at his peak in Colombia. His cartel wasn't merely smuggling drugs, it was building housing, schools, and even a zoo. The same thing is happening in many parts of Mexico, where cartels fund public services, supply food to struggling communities, and offer protection in places where law enforcement is either absent or corrupt. Economically, removing a structure that employs hundreds of thousands, if not millions, would create an unemployment crisis that neither Mexico nor the U.S. is prepared to handle at this time. The drug trade is estimated to be worth over $30 billion annually, and a large percentage of this money circulates through local economies. In most places in Mexico, cartel money is the only thing keeping businesses afloat, and many people argue that dismantling an organization like this would drive more people into desperate situations, which will fuel even more crimes rather than eradicating them. Also, politically, any large-scale U.S. military intervention in Mexico would almost certainly trigger nationalist resistance from both the government and the Mexican people, regardless of their views on the cartels. Mexico has always been highly protective of its sovereignty, and any direct U.S. military would be seen as an invasion, causing widespread backlash. Mexico still remembers the 1846 Mexican-American War, in which the U.S. seized nearly half of Mexico's territory. They mourn it as a national tragedy, which is why the suggestion of U.S. military action on Mexican soil, whether to fight cartels or for other reasons, is met with strong opposition from both the government and the public. On Thursday, February 20th, 2025, Mexico's president warned the United States that her country would never tolerate an invasion of its national sovereignty and vowed to pursue new legal action against U.S. gun manufacturers following Trump's designation of cartels as terrorist organizations. These remarks were the latest response to President Donald Trump's administration following increased pressure on Mexico to stop illegal drugs and migration migration. But the designation cannot be an opportunity for the U.S. to invade our sovereignty, President Claudia Sheinbaum told a news conference. They can call them the cartels whatever they want, but with Mexico, it is collaboration and coordination, never subordination or interventionism, and even less invasion. The 8 Latin American drug trafficking groups designated as terrorist organizations include Mexican gangs such as the Jalisco New Generation and Sinaloa Cartels, 2 of the country's most powerful and violent criminal organizations. To further protect her country, Sheinbaum said that she would present to Congress a constitutional reform to protect the integrity, independence, and sovereignty of the nation, including against the violation of its territory by land, air, or sea. Still, Trump continues to put pressure on Mexico, warning that if they don't do more to stop these cartels, he will impose tariffs as high as 25% on Mexican goods. New reports from Mexico claim that between 200,000 and 750,000 weapons manufactured by U.S. gun makers are smuggled across the border from the United States every year, often being used in crime. Unlike the U.S., Mexico has strict gun control laws, and it is almost impossible for civilians to purchase guns legally. The country has only one legal gun store, located in Mexico City, and buying a gun is a process that includes thorough background checks and permits. Despite such bans, these ruthless cartels manage to arm themselves with high-power weapons, largely due to the illegal traffic of guns from the U.S. They often buy these guns legally in the U.S., particularly in border states such as Texas and Arizona, and then smuggle them into Mexico. This continues to fuel the long-standing tensions between the two nations, with Mexico blaming loose U.S. gun laws for contributing to cartel violence, while the U.S. has pressured Mexico to crack down on drug trafficking in return. Other news from Mexico reveals that President Sheinbaum won't declare war on drug cartels, but she has moved away from her predecessor's hugs and not bullets approach, which focused on addressing the causes of crime instead of using force. So her government continues to seize large amounts of drugs and send more troops to the U.S. border. In exchange, Trump has agreed to delay tariffs on Mexico for 1 month. As tough as it is right now, the former Mexican president, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, would have caused more problems for the Trump administration in this fight to curb drug trafficking. In 2023, he publicly announced that his country does not produce or consume fentanyl, despite enormous evidence to the contrary. His statement came during a visit to Mexico by Liz Sherwood Randall, the White House Homeland Security advisor, to discuss the fentanyl crisis. This was around the time when U.S. Republicans were in discussions to use the U.S. military to attack drug labs in Mexico. Here, we do not produce fentanyl, and we do not have consumption of fentanyl, López Obrador said. Why don't they take care of their problem of social decay? He went on to list reasons like single-parent households, parents forcing their adult children to leave home, and families placing elderly relatives in nursing homes, but only visiting them once a year, as reasons why Americans might be turning to fentanyl. This sparked controversial reactions among U.S. officials who debate that almost all the fentanyl consumed in the United States is produced and processed in Mexico. Last we checked, fentanyl is responsible for about 70,000 opioid deaths per year in the United States. In February 2023, the Mexican army announced that it seized more than 500,000 fentanyl pills in what it called the largest synthetic drug lab found to date. The army said the outdoor lab was discovered in Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa State. In 2021, the military raided a lab in the same city, claiming it likely produced 70 million blue fentanyl pills per month for the Sinaloa cartel. The president is lying, said Mexican security analyst David Saucedo. The Mexican cartels, above all the CJN and the Sinaloa cartel, have learned to manufacture it. They themselves buy the precursor chemicals, set up laboratories to produce fentanyl, and distribute it to cities in the United States and sell it. Around this time also, Senator Lindsey Graham, a senior U.S. senator from South Carolina, suggested that the military should have the authority to target these drug organizations wherever they operate. He made it clear that this does not mean invading Mexico or attacking Mexican aircraft, but rather destroying drug labs responsible for poisoning Americans. President López Obrador said Mexico would not accept such threats, calling them an insult to the country's independence and sovereignty. He also warned that he might launch a campaign urging Mexicans and Hispanics in the U.S. not to vote for Republicans. This was in 2023, and 2 years later, the U.S. government is still facing the same resistance from the Mexican government. On another end, people are blaming Americans for Mexico's drug war. According to them, it all comes down to the law of demand and supply. As long as there is a high demand for drugs, there will always be a supply, no matter how strict enforcement is. The U.S. has one of the largest illegal drug markets in the world, with millions of people using cocaine, meth, heroin, and fentanyl. This demand continues to fuel the massive drug trade run by Mexican cartels, who supply what American users and dealers are willing to buy. This explains why, even with billions spent on border security and law enforcement, drugs continue to flow into the U.S. because the demand never stops. In the 1990s, the U.S. government aggressively targeted Colombian cocaine cartels, particularly the Medellin and Cali cartels. This led to the annihilation of major Colombian trafficking networks, but rather than ending the cocaine trade, the supply chain shifted. Mexican cartels, which had previously acted as middlemen, took over the trade, controlling the routes and distribution into the U.S. Also in the 2010s, when authorities cracked down on opioid painkillers, users turned to heroin and then fentanyl. This is just the sad reality. As long as Americans want drugs, suppliers will always find ways to meet that demand, whether through smuggling, underground labs, or new synthetic drugs. So instead of focusing only on stopping supply, many argue the U.S. should address the root causes of drug addiction. Newly released articles report that Donald Trump's policies could leave the U.S. more vulnerable to dangerous synthetic drug trafficking from abroad, even as the administration has vowed to stop fentanyl from entering the country. Jim Crotty, the former Drug Enforcement Administration Deputy Chief of Staff, called the approach coercive and said it has the potential to backfire. U.S. overdose deaths began to decrease significantly for the first time in 2023 after rising for decades. But Crotty also reported that this progress is fragile. We're seeing this decrease in overdose deaths, and everyone's still trying to suss out exactly why. I don't think now is the time that we want to stop any of those existing efforts, because we know that at least some, or a combination of them, have been working, Crotty said. Will deploying Delta Force and other special forces really stop drug trafficking in the U.S.? How will the cartels react to such a move? Would they crumble under pressure or strike back with even greater force? Or maybe the U.S. is better off refining the strategies that are already in place rather than stepping into a war with no clear end. Only time will tell. With that, we've come to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to click on any of the tabs showing on your screen right now to enjoy more interesting content.